All right, guys. So today we're going to be taking a look at the causes of World War II. So keep in mind we just wrapped up the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression, which is going to lead into World War II. And I know we mentioned this a number of times. Just always keep in the back of your mind that even though FDR and his administration tried to end the Depression through economic programs and things like that, ultimately it was the World War II that ended the Great Depression. So one thing I want to mention is just keep in mind that as we go through this section of notes, which is the causes that led up to World War II, just remember a lot of these events that we're going to be talking about occurred during the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression. So even though when we went over those two units, we were kind of focused on those specific aspects and events of the 1920s and 30s, these causes that would lead up to World War II were all taking place simultaneously as the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression. World War II is going to start in 1939, so the Depression was basically, started right in the late '20s and early '30s. So like it says here, after the Great War, so when it talks about the Great War was the name for World War I. So we're talking about what was happening immediately after World War I. Like it says here, over 8 million people had died during the Great War. It was the deadliest war in history up until that point. Now, obviously, it's going to be overshadowed by World War II. But World War I was really the first large-scale war since the Industrial Revolution. That's why the death toll was so high. And what I mean by that is the Industrial Revolution introduced a lot of new weapons, and weapons on a mass scale. So you had factories producing bullets and, a lot of new inventions that you should have gone over in US 1, such as the airplane, the submarine, machine guns. All these new weapons of war were created prior to World War I. And so when World War I was fought, that was the first war where they used a lot of these new weapons. And so there was a death toll on a mass scale that the world had never seen. So the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom summed up the nation's doubts concerning peace when they said, "War to end war has proved a failure. The war is won, yet nowhere is there peace, security, or happiness." So essentially, World War I was referred to as the war to end all wars. They thought that World War I was going to be so destructive and just, so many people were going to die and so much suffering was going to occur that nobody would ever want to go to war again. And in reality, that's partially true, and we'll get into this because, although World War II obviously is going to happen, most nations tried to avoid World War II at all costs. They tried a lot of different measures to try and avoid another, a large-scale war like World War I, but obviously those measures failed. But that's kind of what the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is talking about here. They're saying, the war to end all war didn't seem to necessarily work, and so that was one of their goals, was to try and ensure that this wouldn't happen again. Isolationism, like it says here, many Americans favored a policy of isolationism, and isolationism is literally a policy that would it's basically what the name states, which is the United States would isolate itself from the rest of the world. And so like it says here, Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, he told Americans to avoid entangling alliances, which would drag the United States into another war. So essentially he's saying, don't get pulled into these European conflicts because it's really going to be no benefit to the United States. So a lot of Americans favored this policy of isolationism because, especially after World War I, we said, a lot of Americans were saying, why did we go over to Europe and fight this war that we really had no interest in? It really wasn't our war. It was Europe's war. It was Germany. It was Great Britain. It was France. It was, their conflict. And then we went over there and, we came out of it, better off than most nations, like I mentioned before, but we still had a pretty high death toll. And, why should we have gotten involved? And, we talk about this even still today. We have the conflict in the Ukraine, and there's a war going on in Israel. And a lot of people, there's obviously two sides to every, event, but a lot of people are saying, why should we go over there and fight this war or help either side, or why should we be sending our tax dollars over there to fund, these militaries and things like that? So, that's kind of the mindset after World War I here in the United States was most Americans favored isolationism. Let's isolate ourselves, forget about Europe. Let's just enjoy our lives here in America. And, that's what the 1920s were all about. That's why everybody was here partying. We're not worrying about Europe. Republicans tend to want to focus on the United States and not worry about what's going on in other parts of the world. When Trump was president, he was basically quoted as saying, like, it's America first. We're going to take care of ourselves first. Democrats tend to want to help out the rest of the world more. Presidents like Joe Biden are going to say, we need to go help the Ukraine. I mean, Biden's made that well known. He's saying we should go help the Ukraine. He's publicly stated that the U.S. is supporting Israel in that conflict. So, but like it says here, it's one of the reasons why the United States did not join the League of Nations, even though it was a U.S. idea to create the League of Nations, which was a coalition to prevent future wars. We never joined it because the Republicans in Congress never approved it, because they didn't want to, again, get dragged into any type of European conflicts. Just some protesters saying no foreign entanglements. So the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, again, Americans try to use diplomacy to promote world peace and negotiate disarmament. Diplomacy is referring to nonviolent means, right? So we're talking about, basically compromises and agreements and treaties and those types of things where we're not fighting. We're going to promote peace and freedom by, like I said, non-violent means. And so, like it says here, disarmament was a big part of this strategy, which is just the reducing of the size of a country's military. So essentially, the mindset was, if we can get countries to agree to give up at least parts of their military, maybe even a big part of their military, then obviously wars are not going to be possible, because at least on that scale, like World War I. So here it says Emily Green Bulk and Jane Addams were proponents of disarmament and organized efforts to see the global weapon supply reduced, and both were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. So, they are outspoken proponents of, worldwide disarmament. There they are, Jane Addams and Emily Bulk. So Charles Evans Hughes was a major player in the Washington Conference. He organized the Washington Conference, which focused on naval disarmament and Pacific security. Keep in mind, at this point in time, there, wasn't a huge Air Force in any nation yet. The Air Force was kind of still emerging as its own, own type of warfare, fighting in the air with jets and planes and things like that. World War I was the first war that used planes, and then World War II started out with propeller planes, the older type of planes, and then by the end there would actually be jets. But for the most part, the Navy was the big branch of the military, and that's because of battleships and things like that. So this guy suggested the major powers of the world destroy 66 large warships. Also, he suggested a 10-year naval holiday, as he called it, during which no battleships or battle cruisers would be built. So essentially, we're going to decrease the number of battleships in the world, and then we're not going to make any more for 10 years. And so, again, obviously the strategy here is by limiting the amount of weapons that are available or made, you will limit the ability to wage war. So again, at the Washington Conference, Hughes also proposed that the U.S., Great Britain, and Japan destroy or retire some of their ships to limit their naval power. So these were some of the most powerful countries in the world. France and Italy's navy would be half the size of Japan's. This became known as the Five-Power Naval Treaty. Another outcome of the conference was the Four-Power Naval Treaty, which Britain, France, Japan, and the U.S. would agree to respect one another's territories in the Pacific, which is another common cause for war, which is fighting over territory, fighting over land, especially in the early 1900s. The U.S. was expanding its territorial holdings. We were colonizing along with, Europe. Europe had already been doing that for centuries, and then the U.S. in the early 1900s, which you probably should have learned about in U.S. One. The U.S. was out in the world trying to colonize and expand its territorial holdings as well, because the mindset is the more territory you hold, the more power you have. You're adding resources, you're adding wealth and things like that to your country as you're claiming new territories. So the 9-Power Treaty included the members of the 5-Power Treaty, along with Belgium, China, Netherlands, and Portugal. It guaranteed China's territorial integrity and required its signers to uphold the open door policy. essentially allowing for free trade. And again, countries aren't fighting over who's going to have control over those trade ports and things like that. So Japanese Admiral Kato Thomas Scarborough stated, Japan is ready for the new order of thought, the spirit of international friendship and cooperation for the greater good of humanity, which the conference has brought about. So Japan is basically saying, we're on board with this movement towards peace, but as we're going to talk about here shortly, their actions would say otherwise. So there he is. So the Kellogg Brand Pact was created by French Foreign Minister Aristide Brand. He proposed that France and the United States enter an agreement to outlaw war. The U.S. Secretary of State, Frank Kellogg, who this was also named after, suggested that the pact should include all nations, not just the U.S. and France. Eventually, 62 countries would sign the Kellogg Brand Pact, and despite the optimism of some of these senators, one U.S. senator remarked that it was as effective to keep down war as a carpet would be to smother an earthquake. So essentially saying, like, this isn't going to work. So the mentality was, let's make war illegal, and then that will keep people from starting wars. But like this quote says, basically, just because something's illegal doesn't mean people aren't going to do it. So he's saying this isn't going to work, but it was an attempt nonetheless. Some war debts and reparations. So the United States became a creditor nation during World War I, meaning we were giving money to other countries. The debtor nations, which owed us money, felt that the loan should be canceled. David Lloyd George was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who was one of the countries that owed us money. He said the United States did not, from first to last, make any sacrifice or contribution remotely comparable to those of her European associates in life, limb, money, material, or trade towards the victory which she shared with them. So essentially, he's saying the United States shared in this great victory of World War I, but they didn't contribute nearly as much because they came in towards the end and basically got to share in the spoils, whereas countries like England were in it from beginning to end. They lost a lot more people, spent a lot more money. They had to sacrifice a lot more to get that victory. And so David Lloyd George and some of these other world leaders were saying that the United States should cancel the debt that is owed to them by these countries because the U.S. really benefited from that victory, and so therefore they should just consider that and basically eliminate the debts. The Weimar Republic. Following World War I, the Germans set up a parliamentary republic known as the Weimar Republic. Keep in mind, the Germans were defeated in World War I. And then, like it says here, under the Weimar Republic, Germany suffered from hyperinflation. The German mark, or the German dollar, as we would know it, lost most of its value. Marks became worthless, so their dollars became worthless. Germany's economy suffered as a result, and the Weimar Republic lasted until Hitler and the Nazis would seize power. So this was one of the contributing factors to the rise of the Nazis. Was Germany was in such bad shape after World War I, like their economy was destroyed, their government was destroyed, their country was destroyed. They really as low as they could get just overall as a nation. And, we'll get into this a little bit more later, but essentially Germany was in such a bad state that they were desperate for somebody to come in and save them. They needed a savior. And so when Hitler begins to rise to power, he starts making a lot of promises, and then he starts to actually create results, which means like he's, not only is he making the promises, but he's kind of fulfilling those promises. That's one of the reasons why the nation got behind Hitler, was because he was really saving them, because they were treated so harshly after World War I. And, again, the German people were they were desperate. Again, hyperinflation. We've talked a little bit in here about about normal inflation, which that's the symbol of the Weimar Republic. I'll show you a few pictures here in a second, but hyperinflation is essentially when your money just loses all of its value. So the U.S. did go ahead and cancel part of the debt that Germany owed it. In 1921, a reparations commission had set total German reparations at 132 billion gold marks, or $32 billion. Germans bitterly condemned the reparations as too harsh. They're saying that's too much, too expensive. We can't pay that. And so what Germany started to do as a result, in order to try and pay back their debt, is the German government started printing paper money to just pay back that debt because they owed so much. But what happened as a result of that is it caused massive inflation. And again, the German mark lost its value because the government was just printing off too much money. So that's one of the reasons why, today here in the United States, we're $33 trillion in debt. And a lot of people say, well, why don't we just print off $33 trillion and we'll pay it off and then we'll go from there. But if we did that, it would cause our money to become worthless. And that's what happened in Germany. That's why we can't do that. The reason that money's valuable is because it's scarce. And so when you just make too much of it, again, it just causes the money to just become paper. It's basically like going out and just picking it off of trees. So Ernest Hemingway, the famous author, went to from France to Germany, and he described the extreme differences in prices, saying that he took some French money and then exchanged it. So for 10 francs, which was French money, he received 670 German marks. The 10 francs amounted to about 90 cents in Canadian money. That 90 cents lasted he and his wife for a heavy day of spending, and at the end of the day, they still had 120 marks left. And then Kiel's Best Hotel, which is a very well turned out place, served a 5-course table meal for 120 marks, which amounts to 15 cents in our money. So essentially he's saying the German money was so worthless, we went there with, just a few bucks, and we were able to buy all kinds of stuff and have a great meal and still had some money left over. So, there's something called the exchange rate, which is you exchange US or Canadian money for, French or German money. And so that's kind of how it was at the time. So again, hyperinflation is just an extreme increase in inflation that causes the nation's currency to lose its value. And in this picture, you see a guy, and he's sweeping up German marks in the street. So these are essentially German dollars. So you can only imagine seeing, American dollars in the street like that. People be pushing each other out of the way to try and pick them up. But in this case, the Germans aren't even concerned because the money's so worthless, it's basically just trash. There's a lot of pictures like that out there. This is the picture of a German mark. They don't exist anymore. The Germans have since switched over to the euro. But when I was in Germany, they still had the mark. I actually have some of these at home. But you can see here, this lady's starting her stove fire using marks, literally burning money because it's so worthless. You see some pictures like this where these kids are playing with stacks of money that are just worthless. And then this guy's going to essentially go buy his lunch with that wheelbarrow full of money. So it'd be like going down to the cafeteria, buying a slice of pizza and a Snapple, and it costs you like $18 million or something like that. And these are just some charts here showing you 1918, here's the mark. By 1923, the mark became pretty much worthless. And this is a chart just showing regular inflation. So in 1970, you could get a cup of coffee for a quarter. In 2019, it's $1.59. That's inflation. That normally happens gradually over time. But hyperinflation is when it happens very rapidly, like it did in Germany. So the Dawes Plan in 1924, Charles Dawes proposed a plan that provided loans and allowed more time for Germany to pay back its reparations. In 1931, as the Depression deepened here in the U.S., Herbert Hoover declared a year's moratorium on reparations and war debt. So he told Germany they didn't have to pay it because he knew they didn't have the money. The elements of global depression created a highly volatile situation that would eventually erupt into World War II. So because of this global depression and because things got so bad, people got desperate and things just got pretty crazy. We're going to watch some videos on this kind of stuff that will illustrate this a little better. But things were getting really chaotic and crazy, and people were craving organization and structure. And that's why you see these totalitarian dictators like Hitler and Mussolini rise to power, because the people were craving like some sort of structure and order to their societies because of the chaos that had emerged during the Depression. And so we'll check out some of these videos here. Okay, let me just stop. So